March 2006, and the cruise ship Star Princess had just set off from Port Everglades in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, for a 7-day Eastern Caribbean cruise. The ship was to tour the Grand Cayman Islands, with stops at popular tropical ports along the way. For the passengers that excitedly stepped aboard that day, she was essentially like a floating town. With a gross tonnage over 108,000 tons and an overall length in excess of 984 feet, 289 meters, Star Princess was among the first of a new generation of supership. It was very easy to get lost on board. For passengers, the 7-day voyage was supposed to be a trip to remember. It would be, but not for the reasons they expected. Just days later, Star Princess is a charred, hulking mess. A passenger has lost his life. The deadly sequence of events that led to this calamity, and the investigations that came as a result, would cast scrutiny over the entire cruise industry. Star Princess's owners had followed the book, but regulations and safety standards weren't up to scratch, and a loophole would prove deadly. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and this is the harrowing true story of the Star Princess fire. It's 2:50 a.m. on Thursday, 23rd of March, 2006. The Star Princess drifts steadily through the dark Caribbean, bound from Grand Cayman into Montego Bay. Most of the 2,690 passengers are asleep after another day spent beneath the sun, indulging in food and good company. Their ship effortlessly glides through the Caribbean, even though a northeasterly wind smacks the port bow at nearly 30 knots. Star Princess is a relatively new ship. At just 5 years old, the Grand Class cruise ship is the jewel in the crown of Princess Cruises' fleet, one of the newest in a fleet of so-called super ships, up to code on all the relevant SOLAS safety standards, the strict regulations that dictate how ships can be designed, built, and operated. With maximum capacity for about 3,700 passengers and crew, entertainment on board is spread over 13 decks, and they can enjoy the lap pool, the salon, the conservatory up on the sun deck, or a suite of theatres, restaurants, and shops down below like the Princess Theatre, the Crown Grill, and the Explorer's Lounge down on the promenade deck. A security patrol officer walks along the port side of Deck 14 by the Lido and Calypso pools. He pauses. He can smell the faint, unmistakable whiff of something burning. He scans the deck, looking for any signs of fire, but he sees nothing. As a precaution, he phones the officer of the watch on the ship's bridge, and he reports the smell. At 3:09 a.m., a passenger in a stateroom, B254, on Deck 11, awakens to a strange light. He can see a flickering on the reflection of his glass balcony doors. He rises, goes to the balcony to peer over the edge, and then his stomach drops. On the balcony below, flames lick at a beach towel draped over a plastic chair, and they're spreading quickly. The passenger rushes to the adjoining cabin to alert his friends as the fire smolders and grows. He raps on the door and then sprints down the corridor to a manual fire call point. Without hesitation, he smashes the glass and presses the button. Hundreds of feet away at the bridge, the control panel flicks over red. The crew on lookout swivel and rise from their chairs, turning to face the port side of the ship from where the alarm has been activated. They see it, meter-high flames licking upwards along the ship's superstructure, moving aft quickly as the fire hungrily takes hold and it's fanned by the breeze. It's a strange sight. The metal exterior of the ship is burning fiercely. The officer of the watch makes an immediate broadcast. Assessment party to Deck 11, Zone 5, port side. Within minutes, both captain and staff captain are on the bridge wing, staring down at a line of fire, belching thick clouds of smoke into the night sky. The skipper calls for the activation of the smoke control systems, and mist heads automatically begin diffusing a thin sheen of water over the flames, and decks not yet burned. The wind from outside, however, cannot be controlled. With a 30-knot breeze threatening to supercharge the blaze, the captain orders an urgent course change, turning his ship until the wind hits its starboard bow, starving the fire on the other side of the oxygen it needed. This helps, but only a fraction. By now, the fire has already raced into decks 11 and 12. It's moving fast, faster than anybody could expect. It seems to be fueled by something. Across decks 10 and 11, cabin doors fly open, children wail in their mother's arms, and the smoke diffusing into the corridors continues to thicken by the second. Outside, flames leap unpredictably between balconies. Glass doors explosively shatter inward, sending shards flying over the buckling laminate floors. The passengers, still in their pajamas, scramble towards the safety of their muster zones, strapping on their life jackets. As all of this is happening, passengers up on deck 12 are only just awakening to the nightmare. None had heard the alarms fitted to the smoke and heat detectors blaring into each stateroom and in the alleyway outside.
What a terrible.
That man in a wheelchair is right about there.
One elderly passenger from room A402 opens his balcony door when he hears the commotion outside. Immediately, acrid, toxic, black smoke overwhelms him and he falls to his knees. He tries to thrust his door shut, but it's jammed on its hinge. His wife races to his side and hoists him up by his arms. Together, they stumble into the smoky corridor for the closest fire exit. Further down, the passenger sounds the manual call point button outside of stateroom A342 at 3:16 a.m. Smoke detectors set off like dominoes across decks 10, 11 and 12 into fire zones 3 and 4 of the ship. The captain orders the vessel to slow her speed and cease all ventilation a minute later. The passengers on deck 12 jolt from their bleary-eyed stupor and surge into the alleyways. Their muster station is only decks below, but their opportunity to escape is narrowing quickly. The smoke thickens by the second, and soon it will become too noxious and heavy to push through it. As the last of them leaves their staterooms, the alleyway is swallowed by a band of thick, black smoke from its after end. It curls low and fast, prowling the deckhead before sweeping its glowing embers inside. The assessment party arrives with a hose line, but they advance only by a few meters. A thick plume of smoke swipes them away like the back of a hand. They stumble backwards and pivot towards the elevator lobby at the forward end of the alleyway, away from the advancing inferno. The section leader, tasked with clearing the staterooms in zones 2 and 3, pushes as far as he can. He checks each cabin up to A237, marking the cleared rooms with a wetted towel on each of the door handles. Beyond that point, the alleyway is impassable. A wall of heat and smoke blocks access to the remaining cabins into zones 3 and 4. The section leader has no choice but to withdraw. Just after 3:17 a.m, the flames have well and truly breached decks 10, 11 and 12, and yet some passengers have still not realised they're in the line of fire. Smoke, as thick as a London fog, swallows the corridor's lights. The couples from rooms A344 and A320 have not made it out yet. They cover their mouths with damp towels before they crawl through the soot-stained corridors towards the fire door. This was in line with the fire safety instructions they'd read on the back of their cabin doors. But in the smoky darkness, passengers can't see 6 feet in front of their own noses. Their heads spin in dizzying circles from the smoke that stings their throat and noses. The end of the corridor is only meters away, but in the heat and the choking haze, they have no way of knowing how far their freedom lies ahead. One woman clings to the back of her husband's shirt as he attempts to lead the way, but then the ship rocks in a big sea outside, sending her hurtling into the opposite bulkhead. She screams out for her husband, but she's smothered by the smoke. She coughs and splutters, unable to make a sound, but then she hears him. "Vicky, don't let me die," her husband wheezes. She gropes blindly through the dark, her hands sweeping nothing but soot-coated walls and carpet. A loud thud sounds from the end of the corridor. Her heart lurches in apprehension, but then, for a fleeting second, relief floods her mind. Perhaps her husband has escaped and slammed a door shut in the attempt. Yes, her husband has made it, she thinks, and now she must save herself. She presses forward blindly, her palms scraping along the bulkheads as she claws her way out for an exit. Strangers are only meters apart in the alleyway, but the charcoal clouds make phantoms of them. The couple from A320 claw their way through the corridor. With every passing second, there seems to be less and less breathable air. The smoke thickens. They can't take it any longer. The husband veers left, and his fingers strike a metal handle. He wrenches it open and spills onto the outer deck. His lungs heave as he draws in cold sea air. Behind him, his wife follows. Or at least, she thinks she does. But she doesn't. She remains trapped inside the corridor, head pounding and eyes stinging. Her outstretched hands skim the walls, hoping for a shape, anything to orient her. The corridor doesn't seem to end, but neither does the smoke. It's relentless, suffocating. It's enough to make her arms buckle. Then her hand crosses over hot metal, a door handle. She's about to wrench it open when, from out of the smoke, another figure emerges. Vicky, the passenger from A344, who's equally blind, equally desperate for air. Together, the two women both force open the forward fire door, collapsing into the corridor beyond, and the door slams shut behind them. Meanwhile, other passengers step out of their staterooms and straight into a dense wall of smoke. They drop to their knees, coughing and heaving. The corridor has become nothing but a tunnel of churning monoxide. They retreat blindly back inside their cabins and force the door shut. One of them tries to dial 911, but the phone line only buzzes, and no one answers. Thinking quickly, some soak towels in water and press them along the gaps of the door. They haul their mattress against the door frame, keeping out as much smoke as possible. Lying side by side on the floor, where the air is only marginally clearer, they listen to the sound of their laboured breaths, praying that help is on its way. 3:38 a.m, and the staff engineer is flanked with a team of deck and engine fire crew who rush to the forward staircase separating zones 2 and 3 on deck 12. Moments earlier, they were spread across decks 14 and 15, boundary cooling the surrounding area so the fire couldn't catch. The fire team secure their breathing apparatus and kick open the fire screen door. The thick, searing smoke pours along the alleyway. The chief engineer locates two women in the first stateroom. Before ushering them to safety, he orders the fire crew to continue forward, knowing there are still remaining passengers trapped inside. The fire crew shine their torches across the bulkheads, but the light carves only a narrow slit through the smoke. Their gloved hands skim the walls as they inch forward, testing each step. Then, their torchlight catches something pale. It's a man, lying on his back in the corridor. His breath is shallow, and his pulse is slow, but he's alive. The crew drag him clear of the passage and radio for a stretcher party. But then only meters away, they find another man on his side. But this time, they can't find a pulse. 3 of the fire team pull him from the alley. A medical party swiftly moves into action when they arrive on scene moments later. The fire team returns to the smoky corridor once more, determined to account for any passengers still missing. They finally find the couple barricaded inside their cabin, having sealed themselves against the fumes, and get them to safety. Outside, in the alleyway, one of those male passengers has a ventilation mask strapped over his face. The medical team swiftly begin chest compressions, counting aloud over the hiss of oxygen. Another medic monitors his pulse. Seconds turn to minutes, but there is no response. The passenger is pronounced dead at the scene. He's identified as 72-year-old Richard Liffridge. In the end, it took the fire team 90 minutes to extinguish the flames and smoke. By 4:36 a.m, 79 staterooms had scorched and melted from the sheer heat. A total of 13 passengers suffering from smoke inhalation were treated in the ship's medical centre, and one, Mr. Liffridge, had lost his life. The Star Princess fire was big news. This was a modern vessel only 5 years old, and yet a fierce, fatal blaze had ripped through the ship's superstructure with ease. Investigators had to get to the bottom of it, and what they found would shock the industry. So, how had the fire actually started? Fires on passenger ships are nothing new, but there's something especially terrifying about blazes that break out specifically on cruise ships where passengers have boarded to have a fun escape. Some of the worst have happened in living memory. On a cruise en route to the Bahamas in November 1965, the Yarmouth Castle caught aflame and sank. A vintage steamer from the 20s, most of the ship had been fitted throughout with heavily varnished wood and thick plush fabric furniture with soft furnishings. Because the ship was registered to Panama, her owners didn't have to follow US Coast Guard protocol. But even then, safety standards at the time were just incredibly lax. Excessive layers of flammable paint coated the walls, Life jackets weren't stored in every cabin, sprinkler systems malfunctioned, wiring was sparking, and aside from her boats, the ship had only 3 inflatable life rafts. In hindsight, the Yarmouth Castle, essentially a floating piece of timber layered in highly combustible materials, was really a disaster waiting to happen. All it needed was a spark. In late 1965, it happened. Yarmouth Castle burned, thanks probably to some faulty wiring, and it claimed the lives of 87 people. It was a disaster that gripped the world, but it had happened just 2 years after another cruise ship had burned from stem to stern in similar circumstances. In late 1963, the Greek line ship Laconia was out of Southampton on an 11-day Christmas cruise of the Canary Islands when she caught on fire north of Madeira. The fire started in the ship's hairdressing salon and spread rapidly through the ship. The vintage and varnished timber paneling acted as an accelerant. The fire engulfed major stairwells and escape routes, and because the ship was so freshly painted, lifeboats sat frozen in their davits with the crew unable to knock them free or get the blocks moving. Many of the boats simply burned in place. Some crew were facing the fire with extinguishers installed 30 years earlier when the ship was brand new. 128 were killed. Disasters like this were hugely influential in shaping safety regulations at sea. Back then, in the 60s and before, ships weren't often custom built for cruising. They came from the great age of the ocean liners, where everything was panelled and decorated in timber that could turn a small fire into a blaze hot enough to turn metal into running glowing liquid. In the 60s and 70s, SOLAS, or the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, was born. It's a governing body that oversees everything from the number and positioning of a ship's lights to the amount of lifeboats it has to carry, the life jackets and their locations. But crucially, SOLAS took a closer look at ship fires like the Laconia and the Yarmouth Castle and made some important decisions. Under SOLAS, fire safety standards are very strict. Long gone is the thick varnished timber paneling. Aside from the obvious changes like that, the increased number of fire extinguishers and their regular inspection, the use of sprinklers and so on, SOLAS governs the way ships are even built and designed. In the old days, corridors in passenger ships were labyrinthine, winding, and they often ended in dead ends or crew-only stairwells and doorways that were locked. It meant that in serious fires, passengers looking for an escape route could find themselves cut off. Modern ships built since the 1974 SOLAS Convention have to ensure their interiors are easily navigable, with stairwells that don't lead to nowhere and hallways that don't end abruptly. So after all these decades, when Star Princess was built in 2001, it should come to no surprise that she adhered to SOLAS's standards to a T, specifically those in the second part of Chapter 2, construction, fire protection, fire detection, and fire extinction. But as it would happen, there were a few grey areas where the regulations didn't apply. The regulations dictated that ships carrying more than 36 passengers must have vertical and horizontal internal zones created by A-class fire protection divisions between the hull, superstructure, and deckhouses. It essentially meant that the steel plating used in these spaces for bulkheads and the decks must be able to withstand heat from a serious blaze for at least 1 hour. Meanwhile, bulkheads must be either B or C class divisions, capable of withstanding 30 minutes of fire at a maximum. The Star Princess adhered to all of these, but the widespread use of fire-resistant materials didn't apply to outside spaces like pool decks and balconies. These areas were filled with plastic furniture and deck tiles. If ever a blaze were to break out here, it could all burn fiercely. Improvements to these areas were discussed in early February of 2006, but the proposals were never finalised thanks to time constraints. It seemed unlikely that a burning deck chair or two outside of the ship could possibly cause a serious blaze. But then came Star Princess. Just like Yarmouth Castle, all it took was a spark, a smoking passenger carelessly tossing a cigarette. For decades, or centuries even really, ships' crews have been at pains for passengers to put their cigarettes out on board. But the temptation is always there to simply flick it over the side. But on bigger ships, as the cigarette flutters through the air, it can be sucked back into a porthole, where, glowing red, it can ignite a curtain or a carpet. This didn't happen on Star Princess. It's thought instead that the cigarette landed outside on a balcony, but it landed in the worst possible way. Investigators later concluded that the last cigarette, smoked on the balcony of cabin C318, had been extinguished nearly 3 hours before that officer had reported the smell of smoke. Half the cigarette was found in an ashtray, so it's highly probable that the other half had been flicked over the side and onto a towel draped over a plastic chair to dry on the balcony below. The cigarette landed and, over the course of time, fanned by the wind, began to glow red hot. Then it flashed over. The towel began to burn, then the chair, then the entire balcony as the polyurethane deck tiles caught on. It was that fast and that easy. Worse still, the dividers between balconies were made of plastic polycarbonate. From one to the next, the fire spread balcony by balcony, growing exponentially as the breeze poured in oxygen that made the flames surge and grow. It was a fearsome chain reaction, but only the outside of the ship was burning. That should have been the end of it. But where a fault was found is that Star Princess's glass doors that separated the staterooms from the balconies weren't self-closing, and they weren't built to an A-class fire rating. But this wasn't a breach of regulations. Under SOLAS Chapter 2, Regulation 9, a loophole exempted outer boundaries of the ship from A-class fire integrity requirements. Glass partitions, windows and side scuttles did not need to meet the same standard unless specifically required elsewhere. Exterior doors were also exempt, except for those facing life-saving equipment, embarkation and assembly areas, or designated escape routes. Even stairway enclosure doors weren't required to comply with full A-class fire safety standards. Star Princess's cabins began to scorch from the sheer heat emanating from outside. As passengers awoke to the smell of smoke or the flickering lights, there was no actual alarm. Under regulations at the time, balconies didn't have to be fitted with smoke detectors or sprinklers. The fire took hold and began to rapidly spread without the bridge having any idea. By the time the first passenger had pushed that manual alarm, critical minutes had been lost, and the fire was already surging, unabated. It could have become a multi-casualty event, a fire so severe it swallowed a good portion of the ship's cabins and interiors like Yarmouth Castle and Laconia. But SOLAS regulations had learnt the important lessons from fires like that, and the Star Princess's internal defences held. After the alarm was sounded, the crew sprang into action, and the ship's fire prevention system did its thing. Up to 168 water mist heads activated automatically and continued running for more than 4 hours, cooling the affected fire zone areas and preventing the fire spreading internally. But probably the most important safety precaution that stopped an otherwise terrible incident from escalating was the compulsory muster drill every passenger had to undertake before leaving Port Everglades. On the 19th of March, passengers had gathered to watch a video on how to locate muster stations, what to take, how to put on life jackets, abandon ship protocols. They had also been instructed not to throw lighted cigarettes over the side, by the way. But it meant on the night of the fire, passengers could be mustered in an orderly and calm manner while fire teams went to work. It had been one hell of a night for both crew and passengers, and yet, in some ways, life continued as normal. The crew had managed to prepare breakfast for everyone the next morning. Nearly a quarter of the ship had been scorched, damaged, or straight up incinerated, and yet they still managed to prepare a hot meal. At 10 AM, the ship docked at Montego Bay when it was announced that all passengers would receive a full refund for the voyage and their return airfares covered in full. And just to incentivize them to board again, passengers were given a 25% discount on their next cruise. Hopefully, their next holiday would end with sun and sea, and not smoke and sirens. So, was the incident handled well? Well, that depends on who you ask. The 1,123 crew were of various nationalities, according to the final report. The ship's officers were mainly British or Italian, and the working language on board was English. Senior deck crew were required to have attended a company fire course every 5 years. Meanwhile, bridge officers and engineering officers were attending a company fire course every 3. While neither groups were professional firefighters per se, they were qualified enough to lead and manage onboard blazes. Fire teams were skilled in rapid response. Regular drills focused on spontaneous fire emergencies that would see crew members drop their duties and rush to their stations. That night, as soon as the alarm was sounded, at 3:09, the engine fire party mustered at the fire locker on deck 4. There, they had donned their firefighting suits and breathing apparatus. Additional fire teams were deployed forward and aft of zones 2 and 3 on deck 12. They contained the fire by boundary cooling, which essentially means watering the surrounding areas of the fire to prevent it from spreading further. Once they were able to clear a path from deck 11, the fire teams attacked the flames from the adjacent internal alleyways and the external deck areas. By 3:40 a.m, the fire had spread aft, and at least 7 hoses had been rigged at zones 3, 4, and 5 on deck 15. From this vantage point, fire teams were able to direct the water towards the fire below. They valiantly fought the flames for 20 minutes, until at last, the fire began to dwindle. By 4:36, the fire team had completely extinguished the blaze. It had been a remarkable effort. One of the passengers had been berthed on deck 10. She later praised the captain and crew for how they managed the disaster. She recalled in a forum post that all crew members were already stationed on the floors at the stairwells to guide passengers to their designated muster groups. These crew members were as nervous as we were, though they did not show it, she said. But they made it very clear that their number one priority was to protect the passengers. The speed at which these crew members reached their assigned posts was phenomenal. By the time she and her fiancé had reached deck 7, their muster station, the crew were already seating at least 1,000 other passengers in the Princess Theatre. As we sat in the theatre, she said, we listened to the many updated messages by the captain regarding the state and location of the fire. We were also able to hear the announcements that were made telling the various firefighting crew members which floors or rooms to which they should report. This is vitally important. When Yarmouth Castle and Laconia had burned, there was no intercom system at all. Passengers and crew alike milled around confused and dazed, panicked, because they didn't know what to do or where to go. By keeping passengers informed aboard Star Princess, they stayed calm and collected, and panic was prevented. We did feel a little uneasy, she said, when the captain announced that the lifeboats were being lowered as a precautionary measure, but the calmness of his voice kept us all in check. What about Mr. Liffridge, though? The question remains, could his death have been avoided? In theory, the answer is yes, but in practice, it was unfortunately a far more complex situation. Passengers of the fire-affected staterooms and alleyways on decks 10 and 11 were alerted early and they evacuated very quickly. But up on deck 12, however, the manual call point outside stateroom A342 wasn't activated until 3:16. This suggests that passengers, including Liffridge's, were unaware of the danger for 5 or 7 minutes longer than those in the other cabins. And in fast-acting fires, seconds, let alone minutes, can mean the difference between life and death. Smoke was first detected in the after alleyway at 3:17 a.m. and had saturated the area just 3 minutes later. Although an earlier General Emergency Signal, or GES, might have created greater urgency among passengers, the delay was understandable. The assessment party was already clearing out staterooms and significant smoke hadn't yet entered Deck 12's alleyway. If a shipwide GES was sounded too soon, this could have triggered unnecessary panic and hinder firefighting efforts before the crews were fully in position. During the search of Deck 12, the 2 firefighters wearing breathing apparatuses performed commendably, rescuing passengers from the alleyway and from cabins like A340 in extremely challenging conditions. But the search was temporarily halted when they changed their cylinders after recovering the first casualty. If relief firefighters had been rotated in the way they had on Deck 11, a continuous search may have been possible and the crew might have found Mr. Liffridge sooner. But this would require time to brief that incoming team, who also would have needed precious minutes to orient themselves in the dense smoke. In deciding how to deploy his crew, the staff engineer had to weigh individual experience, physical capability, and how the fire could be attacked from the adjacent balconies. It was all happening very quickly. Another interesting question is, how did the man who was found semi-conscious only 10 meters ahead of Mr. Liffridge in the same smoke-filled passageway remain alive? Well, smoke exposure can be fatal in just minutes. Mr. Liffridge had been exposed to the smoke for nearly 40 in the aft section of the alleyway, where smoke was most concentrated. This smoke isn't the same kind of stuff you get from a campfire. It was noxious, toxic stuff from melting plastics and synthetics that are highly hazardous. The other semi-conscious passenger had likely survived because he was positioned closer to the forward end of the alleyway, and he'd only been exposed to the smoke for 25 minutes. In fires like that, time and distance can make a huge difference. 9 hours after the incident, Mr. Liffridge's daughter, Lynette, had received a highly distressing phone call from her brother telling her that their father had passed away during the cruise. I felt like my life came crashing to an end, she later recalled. I fainted, and when I could speak, I was surrounded by my co-workers. After telling them what had happened, a few of them had heard about the fire and even printed an article that was on the internet. I glanced through the article, which stated my father had died from a heart attack. For Mr. Liffridge's daughter and his family, the cruise line had handled his death appallingly. His daughter had been listed as his emergency contact, and yet, according to her, no one from Princess had called. 6 days passed, and allegedly she had still received no word from the cruise line. Her father's body, meanwhile, remained in the Jamaican hospital. The cruise line would not commit to paying the cost of bringing my father home, she later recalled. In fact, Princess Cruises initially announced Liffridge had died of a heart attack before the full truth of the smoke inhalation came to light. Richard's family later sued Princess Cruise Lines for wrongful death. The case was settled only for the cost of his funeral, which, appallingly, and according to the 1920 Death on the High Seas Act, was the full extent of damages US law allowed for them to claim. Because Liffridge was retired, there were no potential earnings that were lost, and in the eyes of the law, he was no longer providing financial support to his family or his children. So, according to the law, the cruise line wasn't liable to cover any future lost wages. The Athens Convention dictates that ship operators can be held accountable for loss of life or property on their ships if the damage or loss was due to fault or neglect. But the United States is still not a signatory. In 2021, 15 years after the fire, Richard's daughter claimed they never received a note, a phone call or sympathy card from Princess Cruises. It's as if it never happened, she said. Since the incident, the Star Princess has changed hands, bouncing from Princess to P&O, and finally Carnival, where today she operates as the Carnival Encounter. In the wake of the disaster, her balconies were fitted with sprinklers, and the plastic furniture was replaced with non-combustible materials. But it wasn't until 2012 when smoking was actually prohibited on balconies full stop. Richard Liffridge might only just be a number on the MAIB report, but his life was much more than that. He had served honourably in the US Air Force for 20 years, both Vietnam and Korea. After the Air Force, he had worked for the Federal Emergency Management Agency for years, after which he was set to enjoy his retirement. But the veteran's death was not the result of a lawless ship cutting corners against SOLAS regulations. The Star Princess hit the standards where it mattered, but a tragic loophole in regulations meant that cruise ships had a deadly Achilles heel as far as fire was concerned. Exterior spaces were treated as secondary risk zones, even though they were essentially combustible plastic tubs just waiting to catch fire. Cruise corporations don't have the best track record in their legal dealings with cruise ship victims. Their multi-page ticket contracts are littered with legal jargon and fine print. Up against a multi-billion-dollar company, the Liffridge family had to run a legal gauntlet. The crew's efforts to contain the fire were highly commendable, though. The Star Princess blaze was one of those industry-defining moments, another lesson learned the hard way in the long story of humanity and the ocean.